The upcoming presidential election might be a November nightmare. Too many mail-in ballots could overwhelm the system.
Some states have already experienced major delays in counting votes from primaries, and far more people will be voting in November. Ben Kennedy brings us the story.
President Trump's tweet about mail-in voting leading to what he called would be an inaccurate and fraudulent election, and even asking to delay the election, was quickly shot down by both Democrat and Republican lawmakers. The president's tweet that began the political uproar asked delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. But speaking to the media later, the president made his views clear.
Do I want to see a date change? No, but I don't want to see a crooked election. This election will be the most rigged election in history if that happens.
Trump points to concerns over voter fraud and the massive problems with a presidential election depending so heavily on mail-in voting.
Well, what I want to explain to people, but it doesn't need much explanation. I mean, you look at article after article, New York's mail vote disaster. Tens of thousands of mail ballots have been tossed out in this year's primaries. What will happen in November?
New York tried to let voters stay safe from the coronavirus by letting them vote by mail in the June primaries, which led to massive delays. The system was overwhelmed with votes, and many races still haven't been counted weeks later. And New York warns the situation could get even worse in November.
A switch from almost no absentee ballots to approximately 50% absentee ballots with 2 months' notice really strains the system.
Trump referred to multiple news stories about the concerns with mail-in voting. California also experienced major problems, where more than 100,000 mail-in votes were rejected in the presidential primaries back in March. The Heritage Foundation's Hans von Spakovsky explained on CBN's Faith Nation that one problem with mail-in voting is the rejection rate is much higher than polling places.
Just look at the most recent elections and look at all the problems with the U.S. Postal Service misdelivering and not delivering absentee ballot.
And he doesn't think focusing on improving the mail-in process is the answer.
What election officials need to be doing is trying to ensure that as many polling places are open to vote in person. The CDC just released guidelines on how to safely do in-person voting with all those kind of safety protocols in place.
The president doesn't have the power to change the date of the election anyway. That's up to Congress, and they certainly don't plan to do so. But the concerns over a heavily dependence on mail-in voting aren't new. A Wall Street Journal editorial back in May warned that a close presidential election could result in an election nightmare. A close race where votes aren't counted, thrown out, and lawsuits filed. It could even result in an election that further divides an already polarized nation. Ben Kennedy, CBN News.
Well, it's unfortunate the president chose Twitter as the means to put this issue out in front of the American people and having a suggestion that the election be delayed. This isn't the proper forum for this kind of policy. We need to keep to the election schedule. We need to have a presidential election. That's number one. Number two, everyone involved in this process needs to know that their vote counts. Now we've got some problems because we're in the middle of a virus. Do you want to go to a public polling place and put your ballot in a voting booth that how many other people have used that particular day? I think the answer for many people is no, I don't, particularly if you're in the at-risk group. So we're looking at an avalanche of mail-in ballots, and the system clearly is not designed to deal with an avalanche. There aren't enough people within the election boards just to count them. And then the number of reasons your ballot could be excluded. Do you have the proper witnesses to your vote? Have you used anything else on the ballot? Some ballots are being thrown out just because somebody put a piece of Scotch tape on the back of it. Is the postage right? Is the postal stamp correct? All of these things need to come into play, and how do we deal with it? We have a postal service that routinely says we're in bankruptcy, we can't afford what we currently do. and now you're going to overwhelm it with all of these mail-in ballots. This is a time not for getting on Twitter. This is a time to seriously negotiate. How do we do this? How do we have a proper election? How can Democrats and Republicans get together? How can we do this on the state level, on the local level? Every one of these election boards is on a highly local basis. And how do you have standardized rules all the way through? It's a very short period of time. The lessons from New York have not been learned. The lessons from California have not been learned. And when you consider they're still counting ballots in New York after the primary, here we are weeks afterwards, and they're still counting them. Can you imagine being in December and saying we don't know who the next president is? And the vote is razor thin. And now all the allegations of fraud and improper voting and all of these things, the proposals from the Democrats are, let's go out and canvass for ballots. That means we're going to hire people to go out and pick up ballots. We've got to come to agreement on this. This is going to be one of the most contentious elections in U.S. history. And then to do it in the middle of a pandemic, we've got to look very long and hard at this. And if we don't get this right, it's not going to be a very happy America in December and in January. How long will it take to figure out who won?